So given this is the last satsang in a series of satsangs, it seems appropriate to try and talk about tying it all together. And that means describing how it might come into the next phase, which is daily living from now on. The key principle that is spoken about is the principle of non-doership, which has nothing to do with anyone doing any less or any more, in particular any less than they normally do in life. Non-doership isn't talking about how you function. It's not talking about stopping to do things. Non-doership is referring to how we see, how we understand what is happening through ourself and through the other. So it's a understanding about how things happen. So we can have the understanding, which is actually a misunderstanding of doership, or an understanding of non-doership, meaning we see something functioning and we either understand how it functions or we misunderstand how it functions. The attitude of doership sees the bodies, the person functioning, ourself and the other, and the interpretation, the attitude towards the functioning, towards the speaking, towards the behaviors, the actions, the thoughts, the emotions. The attitude is, this is my doing. So what do we mean by my doing? It means that there is an idea about who this me is. And the idea of the me is that it is an idea that I am a separate, independent. Independent means not connected to anything. On its own. Separate is the important word. Separate. Isolated. Insulated. Not connected. So I am a separate, isolated, independent entity. And if we are a separate, isolated, independent entity, then it means anything that we do is a result of that entity alone. Right? It means it has to belong to that entity because that entity is separate and isolated and independent, so it is not influenced by anything. And if that's the case, if we are a separate, independent, isolated entity, then everything we do is only because of that entity. And that is the belief, the misunderstanding within the me construct. The me that says me and mine, my actions, my thoughts, my emotions, my responsibility. And so that's why it's called an attitude of doership, because it sees something that happens and then it has an attitude about it. And it's called the attitude of doership. The attitude of non-doership is really just the dissolving of the attitude of doership. So it's when the attitude of doership is not there, we call it the attitude of non-doership, but actually it's the absence of the attitude of doership and the absence of the attitude of non-doership. The important thing is the attitude of doership falls away. So what we call the attitude of non-doership is the recognition that I am a biological robot. Now, when I use the word robot, don't project onto it your idea of a tin can type robot. And that's what we automatically will do, because in our experience, the word robot has referred to a piece of metal machinery. The attitude of non-doership is the understanding, the recognition that I am a very complex biological instrument, biological robot, biological machine created by life. So actually, humans are immensely amazing biological machines. We have a heart, which is a pump. We have kidneys that are filters. We have arteries that are like pipes. We have blood and other fluids that are like the fluids that run through machines to do certain jobs. We have enzymes and neurons and all, I don't know all we have, but we all know that we are the human body and the human brain, which is part of the machine, is amazingly complex, and it works according to mechanics, biomechanics, and a whole lot of other types of mechanics. And we just haven't grown up with this being pointed out to us. Even thinking is a type of mechanics of the brain that produce a specific output. So calling us a biological instrument or a biological robot doesn't reduce the human experience down from what we know it. It doesn't suddenly mean that love doesn't fit into that, and that feelings, the full range of feelings, the depth of feeling doesn't fit into that. It does. We need to expand our mind a little bit in terms of how we hear the words. Biological robot, an amazing biological robot designed by life to experience life exactly the way that we experience, with the full depth of experience. And so the important point about this is to see that, well, if there's a machine, if there's an instrument, if there's a biological robot, it has to have come from somewhere or be a result of something. And what is the result of? It's a result of, essentially, in the broadest sense, we could say life. Or in an even broader sense, we could say it is a result of source. Now, what we can observe is that the source of the human being is life. That's observable. Just like the source of the tree and the source of the flower is life. There may be a source of life. I mean, you could theoretically say there has to be a source of life. So, where life came from. That source isn't available to us because that source is outside of life and we're inside of life. So we can say that the source of life is something theoretical. We won't know it in practice. What we can know is certain things in life, and we can observe and we can say, okay, the flower is a product of life. It comes from life. The human being is a product of life. It's part of life. It's not separate from life. It's intrinsically part of the whole thing. And so where did this product come from? It came from life. So life is responsible for its design. The creation, and in this case we're talking about the specific creation of the human being, isn't responsible for its own creation. The tree isn't responsible for its form, its qualities. If the tree has a certain defect in how the fibers of the wood form, and at some point the branch falls off the tree because something isn't quite strong enough. It's not the tree's fault. It's how the tree was designed. So if we're going to say it's a result of anything, we can say it's a result of life. But then we look at life and we say, well, life is actually an impersonal movement of energy. So we can't blame life and say, you did a very bad job at creating that piece of wood, that branch, it fell and broke something. It's just a result, just an output of life. And the human being is like that in a very complex form, a result of life. And so we function one way in each moment, the way that we're designed to function. So that means that our feelings, our internal landscape is part of that functioning. Whether we feel good in a moment, whether we feel bad in a moment, whether we have negative thoughts or positive thoughts, whether the body is working or not working on a biological level, whether the blood is being filtered properly or not, whether the heart is beating at a regular pace or not, whether the arteries have too much cholesterol in them or not. All that is the functioning of the biological instrument. And if someone says, yes, but the arteries have too much cholesterol in them because the biological instrument was putting too much fat into it as part of its diet. Yes, that can be the cause, but why was it putting too much fat into its diet? Because it was designed at that moment to function that way. So it's all impersonal. So this is not trying to get. That might not sound acceptable to someone because it doesn't create a perfect solution to life. It doesn't say, "Oh, you shouldn't have put fat in that quantity into your system because look what it did." It doesn't say you should or you shouldn't. It's just an explanation. Right? So the part of us that is attached to a positive outcome, attached to pleasure, 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 is saying, no, this isn't good news. This isn't a way of seeing life that means that life is going to be all pleasure. So it might switch off and say, I don't like this description. I don't like to hear that everything is the way it is just because the way it is, and really we can't do anything about it because we didn't create it. So the part of us that is attached to outcomes has an expectation, an idea of what the perfect world would be, or wants certainty, doesn't want to die. That part of us will say, no, this isn't, it's not a good idea to listen to this. But what if the description is just a description of how things are? If we realize that, we might see, this part that doesn't want to listen to it, doesn't want to absorb it, is really not wanting to absorb it because it doesn't want to see things as they are. And that machine thinks that it is a good idea to not see things as it are, to want it to be different. It thinks that maybe if I want it to be different, that will somehow have a helpful effect. If we see that's why we're not really acknowledging this description, and we realize that not acknowledging this description is not acknowledging just the way it is, seeing it objectively. And in a way, we might say, this is not acknowledging truth. I use the word truth in this context a little loosely, different to what I mean by, well, and really, deep down, actually, are we not yearning for truth? Isn't that what we're really looking for? I just want to know the truth. And then there's the saying, you're not ready for the truth. You know, we've heard that. You're not ready for the truth. But the truth will set you free. So if there's a part of us that says, I just want the truth, well, this description may be a description that is describing things more accurately than our existing attitude to life. So this is a really fundamental part of the teaching. It's fundamental because really it's one of the most important things that needs to change in order for our suffering to start diminishing. Because believe it or not, our suffering is based on this ideal way of seeing things, which maybe is not even that ideal, but what we think is ideal. The way of seeing everything as my doing. So if misunderstanding is in the system, it needs to change. Needs to change only relative to a certain outcome. If we want to be aligned with life, if we want to be at one with life, then we need to be seeing it clearly. Our attitude needs to not be creating a disjointedness between what is and how we see it. So if there is going to be harmony and peace on all levels, then the misunderstanding needs to dissolve. Now, non-doership means that if misunderstanding dissolves, it's not because we as a separate independent entity did it. Right? Because that would mean that there is a doer. So let's look at why all this talking. If there are no doers, someone would say, why do you talk to a doer? Or talk as if you are talking to a doer? Because it sounds like you're telling someone to dissolve misunderstanding. And the explanation is no. The intention here is not on the one hand to say there is no doer, and then on the other hand to contradict that and talk and tell someone you can do something. The reasoning behind saying there is no doer is seeing that life creates the physical entity and then it conditions the physical entity. Moment after moment after moment. That is the impersonal movement that creates everything exactly the way it is in each moment. That is the dynamic that has been in place and is always in place, that in any moment makes everything the way it is. The physical growth of everything and the simultaneous conditioning of that physical entity. And the physical entity and the conditioning are not two things. The human being is a result of the genes, which are the things that, the blueprint that grows, and the up-to-date conditioning. So we talk about them as two, but really it's the one output, a result of these two factors that come together and form one single output, the human being in each moment. So if the human being, the non-doer, the biological instrument, is a result of life delivering new conditioning, conditioning that doesn't come from a doer, that is just part of life. The wind blowing, if it hits rocks or sand is conditioning. When the human being is out in the sun hitting the skin is also a form of conditioning. When we see something, our own experience is conditioning in each moment. The experience we have feeds back into the system, and each moment's experience is new conditioning. And it's not delivered by anything other than life. So the words coming out of Roger's mouth are just outputs of this biological instrument created by life. So we can say the output is an output of life, just like the output out of any biological instrument is an output of life coming through a specific form of life. And that output becomes part of the environment. And if something is in that environment, it interacts with the environment, and that environment is what we can call the new conditioning in the moment. So the teaching is just new conditioning that can become part of the up-to-date conditioning of the biological instrument. That's an impersonal happening, just like the speaking is an impersonal happening. And then that biological instrument is different. In the next moment, the biological instrument is a result of its genes and up-to-date conditioning, which includes the conditioning from these talks. The conditioning from being in the supermarket. If that's where you are, then being in the supermarket is the new conditioning that will add to your up-to-date conditioning. So the biological instrument is always being changed by life, moment after moment after moment. So this is the reason why I say you don't have to go away and do anything with this information. You don't have to have the idea, or I hope I have listened and I understand everything because now I have to go and apply it. Right? Because that would imply there is a doer that needs to go and apply it. You have a job to do now. And you don't. From this attitude of non-doership, life has continued to grow you like it always has. And in the last days, life has been delivering new conditioning. And that new conditioning, however it lands, becomes part of the up-to-date conditioning, becomes part of the biological instrument. So then the biological instrument, the human, what we are, what we know ourselves as, goes out into life like it always has. And it will function one way, automatically. It doesn't have to do the functioning. It can't do the functioning, it can just function. It functions one way according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning. So, if in the past days the new conditioning has added to one's up-to-date conditioning, the understanding that the flow of life, meaning your circumstance, is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. That's one of the concepts that has been thrown out quite a lot, which means part of the new conditioning that will become part of your up-to-date conditioning. And so if it has become part of your up-to-date conditioning, that the flow of life is always, only ever either pleasure or pain, and you walk down to the shops, or you drive down to the shops, you go into the shops, come back, and you have a flat tire. So as soon as you see the flat tire, that is part of the circumstance, that's part of the flow of life. And the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. That's the description that I've been. Pleasure if the circumstance is in line with your biological preferences. Pain if the circumstance is out of line with your biological preferences. There is financial pleasure or pain, sensory or physical, biological, physical or sensory pleasure or pain, and emotional pleasure or pain. All of which form part of the biological makeup, because they're all part of your preferences. Financial pleasure or pain, sensory, physical pleasure or pain, emotional pleasure or pain. So all of those pleasure or pains are a result of your preferences that are part of your biological makeup. So as soon as you see the car tire, which you don't do the seeing, right? The instrument can't help but see it if it comes into its field of vision. And in that moment, it's pain in the moment. Seeing a flat tire on your car is unlikely to be in line with your biological preferences. For some people who love changing car tires, it might be. It's like, oh great, I have a flat tire. You know, I get to change the tire. And I get to have to pay some money to get the tire fixed. And I get to spend some time driving around to the mechanic and things that I wouldn't have to do. This is excellent. You know? If that's the case, if that situation feels like that relative to your biological preferences, then it's going to be biological pleasure. And if it's not in line with your preferences, it will be biological pain. Now, in that moment when the pain is there, the biological instrument might be equipped to understand this is pain in the moment, and the thought automatically arises. Oh, this is pain in the moment. Right? So you don't have to do that thought. That thought will happen automatically if that your particular body-mind organism, the biological robot, the biological instrument, is designed with that conditioning in it, to understand that the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. So when it is pleasure or pain, there is a chance, a good chance, that the thought might just arise. This is pain in the moment. So you don't have to do that. You don't do that. You don't do that thinking. It happens automatically. Now, if the body-mind organism has also been conditioned to understand my happiness, my deep sense of who I am, my completeness, is not dependent on pleasure or pain, meaning it doesn't come with life being pleasure, 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 and it isn't attacked by life being pain, pain, pain. My preferences are affected by whether life is pleasure or pain, because when it's pleasure, it's pleasurable. When it's pain, it's painful. But what I am at my core is unaffected by pleasure or pain. It remains intact. So if we find ourselves facing the hassle of a flat tire, pain in the moment, it's possible that we just drop into being, drop into the core of our humanness, outside of the thinking mind, where your attention might go on the whole of life rather than the drama of the flat tire, just the whole of life. And you realize, actually I exist. Exactly the same as before the flat tire. I am. And then you can look at the flat tire again. You know, it hasn't suddenly magically inflated. This dropping into the core of our being doesn't have some power on making life magically pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. But you've remembered, I am, because you might have for a second forgot it as soon as you see the flat tire, and might have gone into, oh my God, this is an attack on who I am. Not in those words, but a feeling of suffering, which is really, this is an attack on who I am. And awareness might land on that and actually my happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain. Which reminds me, no, I'm not attacked by circumstance. And attention then can go on to a broader experience of the moment. I exist. A little smile comes to our face, remembering, I exist, which is quite a... I remember myself, and ourself is... the essence of ourself is very self-contented. So we have this little smile that says, ooh, for a second I forgot myself, and now I remember. It's like waking up from a dream, a bad dream. You know, you have a nightmare and circumstance, and the nightmare is really bad. And then it ends and you realize you're sleeping and actually your circumstance is good. It's like, I've woken up from a bad dream. For a second, when the pain in the moment takes over and says, this is an attack on who you are, that's a bad dream, essentially. And then we remember, I am. And in that instant, it's like waking up from a bad dream and remembering, and seeing, actually I haven't been attacked. I thought I was being attacked for a second. Wait, I'm not. I am. I exist. I exist. And then you can look at the flat tire and it's still flat. And I exist. I exist. So then that's your first-hand proof that what I am is not affected by pleasure or pain. You find it's exactly the same as before you saw the tire being flat. I am. So this is where it's not a concept anymore. The concept says your happiness, your completeness is not to be found in pleasure or pain. It means you won't become more complete by winning $100, and you won't become less complete by finding that you have a flat tire. And if you drop into your being, I am, and then you look at your tire and it's still flat, and in that moment, I am, there's your own confirmation that what you are is not affected by circumstance. Our tendency, the tendency of the body-mind organism, the biological instrument, is to continually be going outward into circumstance and getting lost in circumstance, being involved in circumstance. Involvement in outcomes. So we see the flat tire and then we're involved in the pleasure or pain. Involved means we lose ourselves. That's what attachment to outcome is talking about. Attachment to outcome is where we believe that my completeness is dependent on pleasure or pain. So there's pain, and I believe that my completeness is dependent on the pain not being there. And so then I lose myself in the circumstance. And so the human entity is designed to continually be dragged into circumstance because of the deeply ingrained attachment to outcome that's in the system. Right? So whenever we are walking through life, there is always circumstance. It's either pleasure or pain. And even pleasure, we're dragged into it thinking, I am being improved, or now there's pleasure, this is good, and then we're worried, what if it gets taken away? What's going to happen when it ends? So the attachment to pleasure and pain is there even when the situation is pleasurable, and then we're afraid of it changing. So we don't get to really know ourselves even when there is pleasure, because we are defining ourselves on the pleasure. We're worried when it's going to end, and even when it's there, and let's say we're not worried about it ending, we're still feeling defined by it. Because the attachment is there that says, I am dependent on pleasure and pain. So that attitude means we don't actually remain grounded in I amness, even when there is pleasure, not just when there is pain in the moment. So, we feel that who I am is dependent on outcomes, on pleasure or pain. I feel like I am added to or subtracted from, depending on the circumstance. That is essentially the definition of attachment to outcome. So, because that is in the system, that belief is in the system, we're continually dragged outward, trying to find ourselves out in circumstance. That's why we have these expectations about how life should be in the future and what I need my life, how I need to plan it, and hopefully it'll get there. And we believe if it gets there, in line with our expectation, then everything will be okay. And for some people, many people, they do get where they are expecting. They set up an expectation to have a successful business or to find a partner. That happens, and inevitably they find it isn't the solution that they thought it was going to be. Because we'll never find our completeness in outcomes. So because we're continually dragged outward into circumstance, into the flat tire, oh, this is an attack on who I am, we lose touch with our beingness, our I amness, that is not dependent on circumstance. So if we find ourselves with this movement of coming inwards more, and that movement of coming inwards really is where this new conditioning, our happiness, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, starts kicking in and cutting off the involvement in the flat tire. The more that starts happening, remember, you don't have to do it if it's become really deeply ingrained, not just the belief, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, but a much deeper exploration. You know, as soon as you drop into being in the face of the flat tire, then you get your own confirmation that your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. So the more often that you get that confirmation, the more deep the understanding that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, my completeness isn't to be found in outcomes. And the more deep that goes, the more automatically it arises when we get dragged into the flat tire, attitudinally. You know, this is terrible. This is an attack. My life is never going to be the same again. Why is this happening to me? And then your happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain comes up and reminds you, come back to I am. And now this movement back home has started to happen. Right? Life has dragged us out of home into outcomes, into pleasure or pain. And this is starting to return inward, return home. You know, and if it happens once after we've been dragged out for the last 50 years, with the belief my happiness is to be found in outcome, the first time is not, it's not magically going to be, I'm home. And then it never changes. We remain in home. The habit is to think that home is out there. So we're going to get dragged out again, probably in about 0.0 of a second. We drop into, bang, that's terrible, my flat tire. And then the thought comes out, no, my happiness is not to be found in pleasure or pain, and come back. And you might not be able to, because the first time it came up, it came up automatically because of the understanding. And we drop into being, and then we get dragged back into the and so then we think that was very nice, that little half a second of peace. So I want that back. And so then we go, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And it doesn't take us back there. And so we do it again, like imagine, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. My happiness isn't to be, what's going on? It's like, rubbing the genie lamp 3 times, and the genie doesn't come out. And you rub it again 3 times, it doesn't come out. Because maybe, the genie says you need to rub it 3 times with a certain attitude. It's not about rubbing it 3 times. And so you rub it 3 times and the genie doesn't come out. It means the attitude is wrong. So if we're just saying, my happiness isn't to be found, and that's just a belief that maybe the doer is saying now. The first time it just came up as a result of the circumstance and your genes and up-to-date conditioning means it came up with the right attitude that cut off the suffering and we dropped into being. And then we get dragged into it, and it's destiny whether it comes up again with the right attitude or not. It might be destiny for, in that circumstance, for there to have been that half a second of peace or 1 second of peace, but then destined for the rest of the circumstance to be filled with suffering, because destiny, our life story, is going to include suffering until it stops. So the process of it stopping will mean some peace and some suffering. So if we realize, okay, so it's destined for me to be involved in the flat tire, maybe it's destiny for something to come up and say, even the suffering is not my doing. So just like it might have been possible if I was a little different, to let the flat tire be and not get involved in it, that obviously isn't happening. The suffering is there. So then the next layer of understanding might kick in and say, even this suffering is a happening. Just like the flat tire was a happening. I'm not so interested in that. Let me not lose myself in the suffering anymore. And you might find the simple witnessing of the suffering without having this dialogue that is the same in principle dialogue as, why did this flat tire happen? This is an attack on who I am. Right? If the suffering is there and it doesn't go away, we might say, why is this suffering happening? This is an attack on who I am. The suffering being here. The attitude of non-doership towards the suffering is essentially the same attitude as towards the flat tire. I am. Even when the suffering is there. Now the suffering is, we have lost ourselves. The suffering is losing yourself. But if there is the capacity to witness the suffering, which really means just not get involved in it, which is not something you can insist on, just like you can't insist on not getting involved in the flat tire. In this example, at some point, the involvement in the flat tire happened, and we understand it's just because of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. The attachment to outcomes was still there, so the involvement in the flat tire happened. So there is an element of us having lost ourselves. And that is the primary involvement. The involvement in the flat tire is the primary involvement. The question is there then going to be secondary involvement? The involvement in the involvement. The involvement in the suffering about the flat tire. There may be, because that could be destiny. But it could also be that there is space, a little bit of space, that witnesses the involvement in the flat tire. So hopefully this little discussion has been helpful at showing that you don't have to go out and do non-involvement. You as a doer can't go out and do non-involvement. There never has been a doer, there's only been a belief in doership. So the cutting off of involvement will happen if your body-mind organism has been shaped by life, genes and up-to-date conditioning in such a way that involvement doesn't happen. Then that is what we call acceptance. But you don't do acceptance. Acceptance is just the absence of non-acceptance. And the absence of non-acceptance is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So you can't make it happen. But we've all been in an environment where life has been throwing out helpful conditioning, the type of conditioning that changes our existing up-to-date conditioning in such a way that acceptance is more likely to happen. So when we say that one of the forms of suffering is expectation, the expectation really is the expectation that life is pleasure, 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 because we believe that our completeness is dependent on pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so when we go out from the shop and see there's a flat tire, we get involved in it if we have this expectation that life is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. But if we have come to see that in any moment life will either be pleasure or pain, so flat tires are a very understandable part of life. Headaches, a very understandable part of life, part of our biology. Some people more than others because they have a specific biology. Rain is a very understandable part of life. Sunshine, a very understandable part of life. Everything, planes crashing, unfortunate part of the pain of life, but understandable. Even terrorist attacks, very unfortunate. You know, the pleasure or pain of life can be extreme. So extremely painful, which means extremely unfortunate for those people affected. Especially the family members, those that have died, well, no, they're not there to feel that it's unfortunate. But to the family members, that's an extreme form of pain. But it's completely understandable within the framework or within the recognition that life on a circumstantial level is duality, interconnected opposites, pleasure and pain, wealth and poverty, health and disease, hot and cold, male and female. So life is never going to be just one half of the spectrum. They're interconnected opposites. So we might say, why are there handicapped babies? The answer is because there are healthy babies. It's a really simple answer to the question why. It's not necessarily the answer that our attachment to outcome wants to hear. You know, our attachment to outcome wants to hear, well, there just simply shouldn't be handicapped babies. Like it wants to hear that it's a mistake of the universe and the universe is going to fix it. Right? But actually, on a circumstantial level, the flow of life is duality. Our attitude can be an attitude of non-duality. how our attitude is an attitude of non-duality towards the duality is not to try and make the duality disappear, but rather to understand the duality as part of a whole. That the whole of life is dependent on duality. Like the yin-yang symbol is a representation of this notion. The yin-yang symbol, to see the non-duality is not to try and make the black white so that the thing is all white, or to make the white black so that it's all black. Seeing the non-duality is to accept the duality of the whole. So the yin-yang symbol is a single circular image or disc. One disc. And yet that disc is painted half white and half black. And so if we only look at the interconnected opposites, the white and the black, as separate things, we don't see the whole. But if we take a bigger picture view, we step back and we see, yes, there is the duality of the white and the black. And yet that is what makes up the whole. That's the paradox of real non-duality, where the duality is simultaneously held and accepted rather than rejected. So to understand that the flow of life is always pleasure or pain, our attitude can be an attitude of inclusivity. So the attitude of doership creates separation around all of the persons and says, oh, you're not part of the whole, we're all independent. And it creates circles around events and say, oh, this event started, at this time and finished at this time. When we really look at it, where does the event start and stop? It doesn't. It's just a continuation of the whole. Time just rolls from one thing into another. So we might say, oh, well, this happened because you did this. And so we put a start to the event. The start was you did this. Actually, in a way you can say the start was that person being born. Right? But then that person being born was a result of their parents being born. And so on, so on. There is no real start. And as soon as we make the mistake of creating separation where separation doesn't exist, and it's only a psychological separation. It's a psychological separation of seeing things separate when they really aren't. So that is the attitude of non-doership, is to see that we are not separate from life, which can be a little hard because on the surface level of our experience, we have a boundary. The body is limited and it doesn't seem connected on the surface experience. It doesn't seem connected to life. When we look deeper, we see that the mother to a child, a baby, keeps saying, "Mama," pointing at herself, going, "Mama," like, I am Mama, And at first the baby's looking at it, like, doesn't know what's going on, doesn't care. Is just seeing movement and sound. And as the baby's experience and the brain continue to develop, the brain tends to recognize patterns. Pattern recognition is one of the skills of the intellect and intelligence. And that pattern recognition creates change in the structure. That's how we learn. And at some point, the baby becomes capable of saying "Mama." It wasn't capable 5 minutes before or 5 days before. It just hadn't been designed. And then at some point, its design has changed where it can say mama, because of the conditioning of the mother to the baby. And the mother and the baby are, in a sense, separate physically. So when we look at the physical aspect, there is a separation. But clearly there is no separation, because the mother pointing at herself and saying, I am mama, 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 mama. It transcends the physical separation. And the same on an energetic level. There's energetic interactions that humans are having with each other and with all of life, that on a physical observation may not be evident. So this is why the separation attitude has been there, because it can appear like we're separate, but we're never separate, both in theory and in practice. In theory, we're not separate because we have come from the earth, and therefore we are connected to it. We are essentially made of it, not separate from it. And in practice, we're not separate from all of life, because in each moment, the environment we're in directly connects to us through our awareness. If this subtlety is understood, the actual non-duality of life, the non-separateness of life, the fact that everything, even the interconnected opposites, are included in life. You can't extract anything. If you extracted anything from life, the universe would collapse. It's in perfect harmony, exactly the way it is in each moment. If a branch moves, something else moves to keep the whole thing in harmony. And so if we intellectually say this shouldn't be, we're ignoring the fact that the universe is in perfect harmony. If our thinking this shouldn't be actually had some power over the universe, we would probably collapse the universe. Except we wouldn't, because if our thinking had power over the universe, that would be part of the total balance. But hopefully you understand what I mean, that even the very, very painful circumstances are part of the overall whole. Our thinking mind says this is good and this is bad, and therefore this is acceptable, that's not acceptable, this should be and that shouldn't be. So we are dismantling the perfect whole all the time with our psychological perspective and creating an imagined something else. Hence, we're out of line with what is, and that's going to feel uncomfortable. If we don't know what is, and we are part of what is, it means we don't know ourselves. You can't know yourself but not know the rest of it accurately, if yourself is interdependent and interconnected with the rest of it. And by default, if you know the rest of it accurately, you will know yourself accurately. We'll never know the universe and the cosmic laws. Really, what we're interested in is human happiness. So we just need to understand life accurately as it pertains to human happiness. So this is where sometimes we hear teachings that maybe didn't add that little bit in, so as not to complicate things, maybe. And then we think, oh, one day when I know myself, I will know the whole universe. And we think, oh, I'll know how the cosmic laws work. Not likely. Actually, not possible. How can a limited part of the creation understand that which is beyond it? So we're looking for happiness in daily living. We just need to understand the very fairly simple dynamics that pertain to this happiness in daily living, that which we've been talking about this morning. So expectation is this attitude that we take into life that says, actually my expectation of life is somehow valid, to expect life to turn out a particular way, which is ridiculous because life is this big beast that got set in motion, long time ago, this amazing force. And we're saying, I'd like this amazing force to be this way, please. And it's like the avalanche coming down the mountain, and we say, can you move a little to the left, please? A little to the right? Now to the left? And if we thought that attitude was of any value, we're just really not seeing how things are. The avalanche is coming down exactly the way it is destined to by these massive forces. Nothing to do with my thinking about how it should be. So when we go out with an attitude of expectation, we're really going out with an attitude that doesn't understand life and doesn't understand what we really are, because if we know what I am is independent of circumstance, then the importance of the expectation falls away. We have expectations because we believe that what I am is dependent on pleasure, and we think that we can control life. So that belief of control comes up in the form of expectation. So attachment to outcomes, which is linked to expectation, linked to the false idea of who we are, is a topic that we need to understand. And so the other day I mentioned that the deepest attachment that we have is the attachment to love. The attachment to love of the other. And why is this the case? Mira, you can't go, this is for you. No, you can go if you need to go to the toilet. So the deepest attachment to outcome is the attachment to love. I also mentioned that the deepest form of suffering, or the original form of suffering, is shame in our system. And the attachment to love is not an accident. The fact that we are attached to love is not an accident, because it's directly linked to the deepest form of suffering, which is shame. Now, shame is based on the idea, I am not good enough. Like when we look at the feeling of shame, it is an intense version of being inadequate. It's either looking at things that have happened and really feeling I am completely not good enough because of the outcomes. And in its intense form, it is just a deep sense of who one is without even it needing to be attributed to any particular outcomes. And the attachment to love is a direct response to this sense of not being good enough. And it's saying, well, if I can get love from another, if the other will love me, then I must be good enough. So this yearning for love is really a yearning for proof that I am adequate and I am worthy. And the only reason that there is this need for proof that I am worthy is because there's an ingrained assumption I am not worthy. And that ingrained assumption turns into an uncomfortable feeling that says I'm not worthy. And then when suffering is there, it tells us what the solution is. The suffering tells us what the solution. Remember, the suffering is an error. It's a mistake. So the solution that it tells us is also a mistake. But it's so convincing. The whole feeling is so convincing. So the feeling of shame says, I am not worthy. And then it says, well, if only I can prove myself as worthy. So it goes out being nice and looking, nice as a strategy to get love. Because if it gets love, then it can go, you see, I'm worthy. Hoping that will dissolve the unworthiness. Now, what if the unworthiness, which I'm saying is the root of the attachment to love, is an error? In theory, that can mean, I've made the wrong assumption about myself. And I'm worthy. If the I am unworthy dissolves because it's a mistake, then we don't need to go and solve it in the way that it says, it will get solved. If you can get love from others, then you are good enough. If you can get success, so waiting for success is really waiting for a situation that you can then put on Facebook for everyone to love you. Say, okay, now look what I did, so you're going to have to love me now. Huh? So this is why we have imaginations about certain purposes in life that we would like to fulfill. I want to, set up an orphanage, for example, and feed these 100 people. Because if I do that, surely then I'm worthy. And we might do that, and still the unworthiness is there, maybe because not enough people saw what we did, they didn't say you're worthy, or they did, and still the unworthiness is there. And so then we think, I need to set up a bigger orphanage. Or it's not about orphanages, it's about making lots of money. Usually it's the other way around. First we think it's about making lots of money, and sometimes that happens, and the shame remains, and so then we think, of course, it's not about money, it's about setting up an orphanage. Right? Which is in principle the same thing when it comes to the shame. In practice, it's not. Even though setting up an orphanage might not solve your shame issue, it will feed people, which is very good. So the shame actually can have some very positive effects in the flow of life for other people. But so that's not to say don't do good things. Don't spend your energy doing worthwhile things if that's what you feel like, but don't think that that's going to deliver ongoing, unbroken happiness. Remember, your happiness is not to be found in outcomes. Setting up an orphanage, being the most talented singer in the world is an outcome. You won't find continuous, unbroken happiness in outcomes. The teachings aren't trying to make you a better person, right? If you have certain shortcomings that are a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, fixing your shortcomings isn't what is going to get rid of the shame. So this is not a teaching that's saying, become a better person. This is a teaching that is talking simply about one's attitude towards life and towards oneself. An attitude that once change becomes a standard attitude regardless of the activity. So if we think the answer is to become a better person, we will always have something to do. If we think the answer is about fixing things that have gone wrong in the past and correcting each experience that we feel embarrassed about or shame about or blame towards the other about, we'll always have because after 50 years of life, there's infinite number of circumstances that have happened moment after moment. It will take you 50 years to just relive the experience, let alone to fix them. Right? So it's not about fixing, it's about an attitude that changes, and then that attitude gets applied automatically to the whole of life. The attitude is the attitude of non-doership and non-attachment.
So the sense of unworthiness disappears with the doership?
Yes, so let's go back. So your question, does the sense of unworthiness disappear with the sense of, with the falling away of the belief in doership? Yes, the unworthiness is directly linked to the belief in doership and attachment to outcomes. So I'll put forward a story, a description of where this shame may have come from, why it's there. Now, a lot of people don't experience shame on the conscious level. There is guilt. Shame is under guilt. I am not good enough. I am guilty. I am guilty of not being good enough. Lack of self-worth, insecurity, shame, under guilt. I am the doer of who I am, and I look at who I am and I see I'm not perfect, so I'm not good enough. I see that who I am was part of this circumstance that led to this outcome. It must have been my fault, so I am not good enough. I'm guilty. So shame, guilt and shame are interconnected, just like blame and hatred. So shame is self-hatred for not being good enough. Now, there's guilt, there's blame, there's pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. These are all different forms of suffering, all from the same root of doership and attachment to outcome, and maybe all from the same root of shame. That's what I'm suggesting. For different people, they experience different forms of suffering in life. A lot of people who experience pride is a lighter form of suffering than shame. Lighter form than blame, although when you have pride, you tend to also have blame. When you have pride, you tend not to have shame. Pride is, look what I have achieved. Look how good I am. Right? And so shame is, I have nothing to show you that I can say, look how good I am. Right? So shame and pride tend not to arise within the same person very often, or at least you have a predominant one, not both. Now, why is someone proud? Why is pride there? Look what I have done. Look how good I am. Is it not saying, who's going to love me for what I have done? Now, why is someone interested in being loved for what they have done? Because somewhere in the system, there is a belief that I am not worthy. And the solution to that is, love me, and then that belief won't be there anymore. If I can get love, then of course I'm worthy. So what I'm suggesting is that even though for certain people, certain suffering presents, at the root of the different sufferings, it probably comes back to shame. For some people, the shame must be so intense that what they experience on a conscious level is shame. Other people, the shame is there, but maybe it's not so intense. And so how it manifests on the conscious level is in pride or blame. Worry and expectation is also somehow probably linked to this, because shame has to do with outcomes, where we are looking at, there's an outcome that wasn't good, and that must be because I'm not good enough. So then we worry. The more of a sense of not being good enough, then the more likely we think that life is going to be terrible, because I'm always here, I'm always not good enough, and so I'm always going to mess things up. And so then there's worry and anxiety about the future. And expectation and attachment to outcomes, also based on outcomes. And so this doership and outcomes are essentially linked. So let me go back to the story about where this shame may have come from. Now, it's a story because you'll see we can't really prove it. So why am I saying it? I'm saying it because through the process, there are different experiences that we all have. And so we can hear feedback from others and start to understand, okay, in that person, this experience happened. Then we hear feedback and it might be a little similar. So we start seeing there's a pattern between experiences that different people have. And a whole range of experience, each person has a whole range of experiences. So, and someone else doesn't. So we can start seeing patterns and experiences that link to certain dynamics, maybe. And what's most important is when you look at your own experience. So first you start with your experience, and then you might add in what other people have heard that can corroborate what your experience is. And what I'm talking about in this context, experience of when these deep energies start coming out of the subconscious into the conscious, which means an energy of shame that may be buried in the subconscious, which means we can't feel it really because it's in the subconscious, which means the subconscious means not where we are, what we are conscious of. And what we might feel is just an emanation. So it's a bit like radioactive material in the unconscious, like radioactivity locked away underground, but the radiation sort of still comes out. So what we can feel from the unconscious is the emanation of the energy of doership and attachment to outcome, or shame in this case, let's say. And how it feels in the conscious is maybe a less concentrated form. It can just feel like most of the time, just like a overall apathy for life maybe. Or it might come out in the form of needing to be successful, right? Really being driven to be successful, which would be an example of the pride. And then from time to time, what's in the unconscious comes up in much more strength. So it's not just an emanation, and we feel it more intensely, but the habit is to push it back down. And so we don't really get to feel it. It's like we feel it and it feels like it's going to kill us. And the body-mind organism does whatever it thinks it can do, what has maybe worked at pushing it back down into the unconscious. Which means we don't really get to feel what's there. And even if we feel, we don't get to see it go through the full process. And if that starts to change, if the system starts becoming more capable of dealing with those energies, then they come out of the unconscious more readily. And there's a capacity to handle that energy without being as afraid of it. So then it can start getting processed in a more complete way than maybe it did when we push it back down. And as it gets processed, we tend to see the story in more completion. So I had little glimpses, visions, in relation to this suffering energy. Now, I'm not suggesting that the glimpses that I have are some sort of absolute proof that this is what it is about. But I don't discard that it could be telling part of the story. So I put it into the framework, my framework that I'm sharing. But it's my framework based on my experience. So you have to use that as a pointer, but then adjust your framework based on your experience. If you have nothing in this area that I'm speaking about, then just leave my descriptions in there if you trust that they might have some validity. Don't turn them into beliefs, just put them as placeholders in that area. And so when that presents, when experience that fits in this area presents, I'll check it out. But for the time being, I'll put that description there as a pointer. Don't turn it into a belief. So, I don't know if it's I'm going to say it now that I've said it. I don't know if it's worthwhile or not, but it's important for me to say, in my journey, even before seeking really started, where I realized I was thinking about this specifically, although I had been thinking about a lot of things that linked into spirituality from a young age, even before the seeking really started as non-duality seeking, my experience of life wasn't an experience filled with fairly intense suffering. So that was good luck. This body-mind organism had been designed without a strong load of doership and attachment to outcome, without a heavy load of the historic doership and attachment to outcome energies, right? Good luck, as I said, not anyone's doing, definitely, because as we've said before, the human being is grown and shaped by life. So the sort of suffering I had was the milder forms of expectation, where I thought what life was about was, obviously I start here and I need to go there and somehow climb a ladder and become more successful, either in work or from a financial independence point of view. So from my teenage years to my mid-20s, it was about, well, how do I improve my situation? That's what my attention was on, and I sort of enjoyed it in a way. It seemed like a good way of spending one's energy, and because I was never really successful, but the sort of things that I aimed for tended to be achieved, and so I move on to the next thing. So there was positive outcome feedback, which made me think, well, this is what it's about. And it's only when I started reading the descriptions that started talking about how outcomes and an attachment to outcomes and an investment in outcomes, thinking that that's what life is about, is error. And then the more I read the books with the descriptions, it became more and more apparent that the attitude I was having to outcomes was an erroneous way of knowing oneself. And as the behavior then started to change, as my motivation to continue the way I was started to change, I started to notice that behavior, that attitude really towards outcomes, was a form of not being present, a form of thinking about the future all the time, waiting for some time in the future when I would be happy. And not that I was particularly unhappy, because the suffering was mild. Still, there was this expectation of what was available to the human, and that my expectation was just better circumstance. So one day, at the same time as these pointers had come into the system, I happened to have good luck with an investment. So I had been investing and improving my financial situation in a little bit, $1,000 turns into $5,000, turns into $10,000 type. It was, that's good. And so then the next goal might have been, 20,000. I'm just making the numbers up. Might have been 20,000. And I said, okay, there's the next 3 years to go from 10,000 to 20,000. And something happened in the investments, and in the space of a month, it went from 10,000 to 40,000, let's say. which is very good on a outcome level, much better than I expected, right? And for about a day, I was really excited that this unexpected increase in a share price happened. And then I noticed that I just forgot my previous benchmark of what it was, 20,000 that I was hoping, or 10,000, hoping to go to 20,000. And my new benchmark was, okay, I have 40,000, now 60,000 is the benchmark. And it occurred to me, so is this how I'm going to live my life? Because inevitably, I'd get to 60,000, and then the benchmark is 60,000, now 100,000. And you get the 100,000, turns into 200,000, 5 million. And then 5 million becomes, it needs to be 50 million.
Did it come from shame? Also from shame?
I'm not sure. But it's not so relevant yet. I mean, on the principle I was talking about, yes. And this leads to the story where I say something was revealed, is why I'm suggesting that the root of suffering is shame. So it was just lucky that things turned out where there's this big jump beyond my expectation in a much shorter period of time. But then I saw that my attitude very, very quickly just normalized my situation and said, no, I need more. And it was that said, maybe this, or not maybe, I said the probability is that every time I get to more, I might have a day of excitement, which is sort of what it was, and then the excitement finished. So this was clearly pleasure in the moment. It lasted a short period of time, but it isn't continuous unbroken happiness. Because with that attitude, you just move on to the next goal. So this is sort of giving you a little bit of insight into my background, saying there wasn't a lot of suffering, but at some point in the process, these deep energies in the system start coming up. And my experience was that the energies come up in the form in my experience was either in dreams at night or visions that were part of an emotion that would take over the body. So there would be a time where I'd sort of feel really lethargic and uncomfortableness, the result of suffering. And my makeup was already do what you feel like, which means get guided by the feeling, and the feeling is go and lie down, or don't involve yourself in other activities, because I was just tired and feeling emotionally fragile when those energies come up, and lie down. And at a certain point in the system, they can be, or in the process, they can become intense, and I would, in a way, invite, at least not resist it, because there was an understanding that this is the deeply ingrained doership and attachment to outcome that actually needs to be reprocessed compared to how it was processed originally, historically. And it can get reprocessed by being felt, and then the understanding of non-doership that in the conscious mind will see the events, will remember in the emotion there is a retelling of the story of the event. And in the event, someone might have hurt me, and that hurt, that pain was taken very personally and turned into suffering. You hurt me, I hate you. And that hatred gets locked away because at the time there was no capacity to process it in a way that dissolved it. There was only the strong uncomfortableness of it, and it gets suppressed. So it stays in the body system. So at some point, these energies, at least some of them, start coming up. And it's part of the deepening of the understanding of non-doership, as well as the transmuting of those energies that have strong doership in them. And in my circumstance, most of these energies that came up were related not to events in this life. Probably because of the reason I said that I didn't have very intense forms of suffering. Circumstance in my life didn't include strong types of abuse, let's say, which would have been more likely to be turned into, attitudes of hatred if someone is really in physical abuse or sexual abuse or things like that. So it just so happened that my circumstance didn't include much of that, which was probably part of why, as well as probably an understanding that was closer to the understanding of non-doership and non-attachment. And so a lot of these energies that came up were energies from other times, events that Roger didn't live, but events nonetheless that people who were part of the storyline in the events, there were situations of other people. Now, typically someone would say, oh, that's my past life. So the way that this teaching holds past lives is that maybe obviously there are past lives, as in lives that have been lived, not by me, but by people in history, John Smith and Mary Jane. They have lived and they died. So there have been past lives. And because we don't understand the cosmic laws, those past lives and the events that had happened in those past lives and the attitudes that that person has had to the event, their attitude of doership and attachment or lack of it, it's possible that those energies, when the person dies, don't dissolve as if they need to be resolved somehow. And so they can go into a universal melting pot and get redistributed to new births. So if that's the case and we end up with some memories of events of someone else's life, then we could say we're linked to that life, but it wasn't Roger's life. Like Roger is this particular thing. That was Jane or John, not Roger. And yet, if in the cosmic laws, those unresolved energies of doership and attachment need to get redistributed so that that misunderstanding of life gets worked out, maybe I get some of that history. Just as data, energetic data. And so if that's the case, it becomes part of my up-to-date conditioning, right? Part of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the person is the way they are according to their genes and up-to-date conditioning, which might include energetic attitudes that happened in another person in the past. And that becomes part of who you are, part of how you will respond to life in the next moment. Maybe quite unfortunate if you pick up the energies of someone who was filled with hatred, and that's your destiny to have some of that energy as your up-to-date conditioning, then you are forced to relate to life in that same way. But it's not your doing, right? It's a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, which includes this the conditioning from another life. Once again, this is just a story based on how I have processed everything, going beyond, in a way, the standard stories of karma and past lives, simply because the way they are ordinarily delivered may be appropriate for people with a certain understanding of life. And as your understanding refines and goes deeper, then you need to look at your own experience and readjust the standard stories and teachings so that the way you look at it is adjusted for how it arises in you. Right? And the more complete your understanding is of how doership and attachment works, then the more capable in a way you are of rejigging the explanation of how things work. Now, so I'm not holding this as a truth, because what I know is these energies came up that included a story of events, some of which were quite tragic. And it was a story where I felt there was a feeling, I am this character. Not Roger, but it's like almost like transported into a dream. And go, I know how this person felt at that time. It's in my system somewhere. Now that still doesn't prove that what I was experiencing was actually a memory or a communication of some event that actually happened in the past. That's what it felt like. So I hold it loosely as, okay, this is how things work. But I don't know that this doesn't prove to me that there are past lives. It doesn't prove to me that I know about John and an event that happened. I know I had an experience of a strong energy that came up and turned into a visual, and there was lots of emotional release and feeling of the emotions that person, at least as in the vision, in the dream, that person was feeling. And there was crying or shouting or hitting or feeling completely dejected, and all of that was there. Now that happened in my experience. Where it really came from, I don't know, but I relate to it as it appears, or as it suggests. There were a lot of these experiences. Now, the one experience that there were also some from my life here, some small things. I had some memories when I was 3 years old, in an afternoon. My mother was resting, the door was closed, and a little boy of 3 years old looking at the closed door, feeling alone or left out. So that energy came up and out, and my relationship to it was, that was something that hadn't been processed, something that had been taken personally by that boy, and so that came out. On one particular instance, one of these visions was of being the baby in the womb and the birthing process, in a way. I mean, not very briefly, it wasn't particularly long experience, but just got the sense in the experience that this is what it was. And in the experience, there was this pervading sense that the baby felt like it was being rejected, thrown out of this place that it was so comfortable in. It's like, everything's good, it's fine, and then suddenly, and bang, out you go. And the sense in that experience was, you're not welcome anymore, get out. And like the baby saying, what have I done? I don't know what I've done. Get out. And actually this was the least intense, strangely enough. It was just like I'm describing it. It sort of gave me an image with some, I don't know, like thoughts about what was happening. Now obviously a baby doesn't think in the way we think when our brain develops. So this would have been almost like a precognitive in the way that we think of cognition, a primal cognition, right? The cognition that a baby at its development is capable of having. And that primal cognition may well be at a phase, at a point where it can acknowledge, I am connected to this, I'm very comfortable, and then an upheaval, and maybe even some ability to feel like, what have I done wrong? It seems not possible when I think about it, understanding cognition from a brain point of view, but then again, how are we supposed to understand what primal cognition actually has the capacity of sensing? So this starts linking into where this primal shame may actually stem from. So if we go to the first event in our history, or as a human, that could be, at least it's one of the very early events. Now, if a sense of self gets put in place in an early event, it tends to then be a sense of self that is carried forward in one's life and projected onto all sorts of events that happen. And if someone has a different sense of self, then they will automatically project onto the events that happen their impression of themselves. And that's why we tend to find ourselves in recurring patterns of relationships with certain outcomes, because we look for that. We look for what we think we need based on our makeup. We interact in the same way, and what we've looked for is the same thing, so the way it interacts with us is going to be more or less the same. And then at the end, it turns out the same outcome. So we have this sort of repeating pattern, and in the repeating pattern there is a tendency to reinforce the self-image, because the same outcome happens. And then, having had this experience, so it got put into the mix, and it started to color how I was seeing this doership and attachment outcome, remembering that I'm talking about shame being put in place for the birth of this embryo, and yet in my life I'm saying that there wasn't particularly strong forms of suffering, and yet this was there. So for some other people there are stronger forms of suffering. And then it occurred to me there may be a earlier event that the birthing process is a repetition of. And the earlier event could be a previous life that someone else has lived. But I thought, well, what about in principle an even earlier event than a birth? And if we look at this principle that source at rest, infinite creative potentiality, absolute nothingness, at some point explodes into manifestation. And it comes to know itself as the manifestation, as form. And this story of life that has been created, this particular manifestation, is a story of cause and effect, of time and space, of humans that experience themselves as separate, and for a while walk through life as separate, feeling disconnected, and that's when suffering is part of the experience. And then the process in the story of life takes us full circle to a dissolving of that error and a seeing of our wholeness, of our completeness, and the suffering falls away. And in that seeing of our completeness, the doership and the attachment to outcomes fall away. So I thought, well, what if Source has inserted this original error into the story? So as part of the forgetting itself, as part of the separation, as part of the journey of living ourselves as humans, not knowing ourselves fully and suffering, what if, in order for that story to make sense, it inserts an original error that we are forced to have in order for the story to turn out a separate way? So this could link into the biblical and the religious stories of original sin. And sin means error, the original error. So sin, as it's developed in religions, is you are the one responsible for your actions, and you are going to be punished for that. But if we go to the etymology and we go and look at it from a non-doership point of view, then sin means error. It's impersonal. And what if it was inserted? So in the process of the unmanifest becoming manifest, and objects that source identifies with happening, there was this sense, what's happened? Why am I here? When the manifestation comes into existence, what have I done to be thrown out of the unmanifest, where there was no problems? The unmanifest is before manifestation. And then the manifestation happens and humans are there. It's like, why am I here? I was very comfortable over there in the unmanifest. Well, there was no one to say I was comfortable in the unmanifest. And so that might be the original shame. Why have I been thrown out of the unmanifest? What have I done wrong? Now, when we look at that, obviously, there is no one that has been thrown out of the unmanifest. The unmanifest has become the manifest. There was no baby that has done something wrong and was thrown out of the womb. It's a natural, impersonal process. And so the baby said, what have I done to get thrown out of this very comfortable place I was in? Could be the first replication of what have I done to be thrown out of the unmanifest? What have I done to be thrown out of the womb? And then in our human form, as a 3-year-old, what have I done to have the doors closed on me? Oh, that's interesting. That example was, what have I done to have the doors closed on me? And then at school, you're left out of the group. What have I done? Why am I not part of the group? And then when relationships start and your partner chooses someone else, what have I done for this to have happened? So, this could be where the root of shame stems from. And what needs to happen is ultimately the non-doership in life needs to be seen, and then these errors will be seen. There isn't a doer that did anything wrong. There are circumstances that happen, and they happen this way. The door was closed because my mother wanted some privacy, not necessarily because I wasn't good enough, but that was the interpretation of that. If the doership falls away, it's like, yeah, the door was closed. That's destiny for the door to be closed, not because I'm good or not good enough. So, if we can use the microphone.
Yeah, and then when it goes into relationship and love relationships, there are a lot of aspects that could come from these stories into what you would like to fulfill in a love relationship. Mm-hmm. But how do you see love, and is there something on the other side of you needing to fix these errors? So if you go into a relationship with your errors intact, then it's easy to get the link that when you go into this relationship, you want the relationship to fix these feelings. Mm-hmm. But on the other side, past the errors, how do you see what is love and what is love in a relationship?
Yeah, so if the error is in place, we're almost forced to live the relationship through the error. We don't really have an option. And in a way, the solution to that is a solution that will happen in time, that as we live those relationships through that era, we have the experience of the relationships, and hopefully with enough coaching from life that describes sort of these sort of things, our own experience starts to allow us to see this, and us seeing it starts to bring about change, which means these energies start being released. And then the next relationship we go into is maybe with less of an error, and so it becomes more capable of having love that isn't a demand of the other to love you, because that's what attachment to love is essentially. You have to love me, I need you to love me. So it's not an unconditional love, it's I'll love you if you love me. Actually, I'm only really here to get your love, and I'll give you love as an attempt to get your love. And so as that whole dynamic gets seen more and more, we are more and more capable of going into love, into a relationship, and not having attachment. Because essentially this misunderstanding is attachment. So when we go into relationship without attachment, we actually go in complete in ourselves. Because if we don't have attachment, we know I exist. And there's a contentment, and so we are not looking for a solution to our uncomfortableness, because there is a contentment. When we're looking for a solution from the uncomfortableness, we're looking for a solution. The solution says you need love, so we're craving a relationship. At some point, we see that relationships can be problematic when we find ourselves in them from that place, unless the two people are very conscious and are working together. And even so, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. But sometimes we will actually say, I'm not going to go into a relationship because it's more complicated. I want to work on myself outside of relationship. Once we're content with ourselves, whether it happens outside of relationship or through relationship, we don't need love. Because we're complete. And yet, because life is interhuman relationship, there are people all the time. Even without attachment to love, we're going to find ourselves needing to do things during the day. Someone will say, would you like to go out for dinner? And you go, oh, that would be nice, go out for dinner. And then you find this feeling between two people. It's like, oh, this was really fun, let's do it again. You do it again. This is fun. You find that you spend time together and you get on well with each other. And a relationship forms. And then the relationship can be a relationship that isn't a relationship that is meant to deliver anything. It's a relationship that stays intact if it's better in a way, if it overall delivers a more positive and pleasurable outcome in life than you being on your own. So if you're on your own and you're content and you're enjoying life, and then you find yourself in a relationship and you see that that person has all sorts of attachments, you might actually, from your place of contentment, say, this doesn't make sense. This is not actually delivering experientially a life that is optimal. Now, love and relationship is very complex, so the feeling, it will be what it is. So if the connection is strong, it can make sense to be in that relationship, even if there is pain in it. But it also would make sense to understand that it could be that there's pain in the relationship and someone says, actually, I can just move out of the relationship and not have that pain and be complete in myself. And if it is destiny for two people who are complete in themselves to come together, then my view is that those two people walk independently. They're not attached to each other. They are complete in themselves, they are really walking independently, and they find that each step they take is a step where the other is side by side. Not because they believe they should be, they're actually walking their own path and finding that their own path is a path that they share. And at any point in time, they will understand that the relationship can dissolve through the death of the other, through circumstance taking them in different positions, and they will feel complete even in the dissolving of the relationship. And yet, while it's there, which could be for the rest of their lives, if it adds value, then it's a bonus. It's a beautiful thing. And love on the flow of life level is one of the most beautiful pleasures, one of the most in-depth pleasures. And so if it comes, it's a great bonus. But if it's not there, it's simply the absence of a particular pleasure, which you may have a different pleasure instead, the pleasure of traveling and having lots of friends or whatever, which may also be a very deep pleasure. And you know that my happiness, because you're connected to it, is not actually a result of pleasure or pain. So you're not intellectually saying, oh, well, but love would be such a great pleasure. You're not even thinking that. It's, I'm connected to myself, and if it comes in as my destiny, then I'll enjoy it. So we're coming to the end of time, but it's an interesting satsang, so we'll have one more question.
Yeah, then linking back to after liberation, what is driving and what is desire? Because it's easy to see in personal leadership that you're going for expectation for outcomes.
Exactly. Yeah. So often, that's a question that gets asked often. So if attachment to outcome falls away, what is going to motivate me to live life? That's your question. Because we imagine we only have the experience of living life from attachment to outcome. And if our intellectual framework of how life works is missing some pieces, we sort of think, okay, take away attachment to outcome. So won't the body-mind organism just sit on the couch, like not doing anything, which really would mean it would starve as well. It would not go to the toilet. The reality of the situation is the body-mind organism is still a biological entity with a huge amount of complexity, including its biological preferences. And the urge of hunger, for example, will arise, and that will move the body. The biological preferences will move the body towards food. The biological preferences will move the body towards the bed when it's tired. And in the morning, once the body has slept, the biological preferences and the understanding of its circumstance will get it to go out and go to the toilet and then go to the kitchen. And then when the phone rings, the biological intelligence answers the phone. So what drives us really is our biological preferences. The attachment to outcomes is an attitude that hijacked. The biological preferences are still functioning even when the attachment to outcome is there. It's just that the attachment to outcome then adds in this whole layer of complexity on top of the movement of the biological entity, and the attachment to outcome also dictates some of the movements, which is where we stop doing what we feel like and we start doing what I should do in order to get this outcome that I believe is so important.